In late 1928, Herbert Hoover told the American people, "We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land." 15 months later, those words would haunt him as the nation plunged into a 10-year, debilitating economic depression that shocked the world. The financial collapse of 1929 followed an extended rally on Wall Street, where a decade of strong returns had attracted ordinary Americans to invest millions in their burgeoning economy. And some of it came in the form of easy loans. The stock market was doing really well, so ordinary people took out loans to put money into the market and then lost it. As speculative fever grew more intense, the market began to fall apart. On October 29th, 1929, the market lost 10% of its value in one day. Within a month, stocks had lost half their value. The Great Depression that followed can be blamed in part on the collapse of Wall Street, but economists and historians point to other events that, at a minimum, deepened and lengthened the crisis. A lack of diversification in the economy, the maldistribution of purchasing power across American society, problems and speculation in the banking industry, the expansion of the European economies after World War I, and the failure of the Central Powers in Europe to pay back their reparations for the war all contributed to the collapse of the financial market, both in the United States and across the world. The stock market crash of 1929 did not so much cause the Great Depression as it did trigger a chain of events that exposed larger weaknesses in the American economy. The collapse of the banking system took with it 9,000 banks in the first 3 years of the crisis, which in turn helped shrink the money supply in the nation and the workforce. 25% of people were out of work by 1932. In some cities in the Northeast and Midwest, over half the adult population was out of work, and early welfare systems struggled to serve the long lines of Americans asking for help. In some cities, it was more like 75% of people lost jobs. Things were even worse in rural America. 1/3 of all American farmers lost their land. The Great Plains suffered from a catastrophic natural disaster at the same time, beginning in 1930. It was called the Dust Bowl. It stretched north from Texas to the Dakotas. It was a drought. The drought and heat continued for a decade, turning what had been fertile farm regions into virtual desert. Hundreds of thousands of families abandoned their land and wandered from city to city looking for work. Because many of these people were from Oklahoma, they earned the nickname Okies as they congregated in places like California to pick crops at starvation wages. As the prices for cotton collapsed across the South and the sharecropping industry fell apart, the movement of African Americans from the rural South into America's cities accelerated. Their prospects for work in northern cities weren't much better. Traditional patterns of segregation and disenfranchisement in the South survived the Depression largely unchallenged. Though America did turn its attention to the issue in the trial of the Scottsboro boys, they were 9 black teenagers who were falsely accused of raping 2 white women, and they were eventually, years later, acquitted. Similar patterns of discrimination confronted many Mexican and Asian Americans in the West, who found it difficult to find dependable work during the Great Depression. Minorities often lost jobs to white Americans, sometimes when these Okies would get a job over someone who was there and had a job already. Women, too, were pushed out of the workplace in favor of men. Still, even at the end of the 1930s, 38% of black women and 24% of white women had jobs outside the home. Though the Depression made divorce less common, unemployed men sometimes deserted their families in an effort to escape the humiliation of being unable to earn a living wage. The Great Depression was a traumatic experience for millions of Americans, but it had the unintended impact of shaping American values for decades to come. The ideals of work and individual responsibility survived the decade, and American culture, via radio and the movies, flourished as a diversion from personal hardships. Almost every family had a radio in the 1930s, and they listened, and listening tended to be a community experience. Superman, the Lone Ranger, comedians, and soap operas filled the airwaves with drama, laughter, and perhaps more importantly, advertisements. Radio news and sports grew rapidly to meet demand. The World Series, the Academy Awards, political conventions, and even Orson Welles' 1938 War of the Worlds broadcast all reached Americans over radio during the Depression. The War of the Worlds broadcast is the event on Halloween where they were reading a story and they made it sound like it was actually happening, that aliens were invading the United States. And some people freaked out and called the radio and asked if it was real. Ticket sales for movies were more popular than ever in the Great Depression. Frank Capra's films, including one of my favorites, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, helped audiences find solace in a vision of an imagined American past, in the warmth and goodness of idealized small towns and the decency of ordinary people. Screwball comedies like the Marx Brothers films, Walt Disney's cartoons, including Snow White, and movies based on popular fiction like Gone with the Wind and The Wizard of Oz helped divert audiences from the tremendous disillusionment and the increasing radicalism, political radicalism of the era. The Communist Party flourished during the Great Depression. Long and unrelenting critic of American capitalism, communists banded together to create an anti-fascist group called the Popular Front in America during the Depression. The Popular Front was, in fact, not so secretly controlled by the Soviet Union. The Popular Front united with many progressive groups and offered an alternative, socialist-leaning path for America as it faced economic hardships. In a show of force, 3,000 young American members of the Popular Front committed themselves to the Spanish Civil War in the Great Depression, where, as the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, that's what they called themselves, they fought against the Hitler and Mussolini-backed Francisco Franco in Spain on behalf of the Republican government and the people of Spain. Communists, American communists, were active in organizing the unemployed in America. They staged a hunger strike on Washington, D.C. in 1931 and stood with the Scottsboro Boys against racial injustice. They were not, though, the open, patriotic organization they pretended to be. And when Stalin signed a non-aggression pact with the Nazis in 1939, they were ordered to abandon the Popular Front, all American communists were, and resume their criticisms of American society. Disillusioned, thousands of Americans left the movement. This is really interesting. This is the only time in American history when communists had clout, and it only happened because they stopped being critics of American capitalism, and they offered a sort of like a genuine alternative to how the economy could be organized. At few times before or since in American history did being part of the political left seem so respectable or even conventional among the American people. The 1930s experienced a widening of the ideological range of the mainstream. The New Deal, for instance, sponsored artistic work through the Works Projects Administration that challenged capitalist norms, and New Deal-backed filmmakers and photographers offered harsh critiques of the exploitation of people and the environment that industrial capitalism had produced. I'm talking about the New Deal. We're going to get to that soon, but I'm talking about President Roosevelt's liberal efforts to stimulate the economy and spend a lot of money. They spent money on things like they gave money to artists. They had the Civilian Conservation Corps. They made parks. They put people to work. The federal government began to employ people to try to stimulate the economy. John Steinbeck was the most successful chronicler of social conditions in the 1930s, specifically in his novel, The Grapes of Wrath. Herbert Hoover, when faced with American economic collapse, relied on the principles that had always governed his public life. Early in the crisis, he called on business and union leaders to adopt a program of voluntary cooperation for recovery. But economic conditions deteriorated so quickly after he assumed office that the structure of his idea soon collapsed. He attempted to use some government spending to fight the Depression, but his paltry sum that he asked for, which is just over $400 million, failed to seriously stimulate the economy, and with an eye on the national budget, he avoided further stimulus efforts. In comparison, Barack Obama's stimulus in the Great Recession in 2008-2009 was, if memory serves me right, $700 billion. And so even adjusted for inflation, Hoover's stimulus in a time of much greater need was significantly less. Hoover did help pass laws to maintain agricultural prices and to disincentivize agricultural imports, but surpluses and declining consumption kept the farm economy in crisis during the Great Depression. 2 years into his term, Hoover's political position had deteriorated considerably. Republicans lost the House and came close to losing the Senate in 1930. But Hoover continued to resist Democratic calls for more spending. Many Americans blamed Hoover personally for the Depression and took to calling the shanty towns of the unemployed on city outskirts Hoovervilles. So homeless people living on the outside of cities, they called Hoovervilles. It's kind of like calling the Affordable Care Act Obamacare. It's very similar, actually. By 1931, Hoover had no choice but to back measures to keep banks afloat and homeowners in their homes. $1.5 billion was set aside for the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, It was a government agency organized to provide federal loans to troubled banks, railroads, and businesses. But the agency was overly conservative, like Hoover, and failed to even spend all the money it had been allotted. For the first several years of the Great Depression, most Americans were either too stunned or too confused to take political action. By the middle of 1932, though, voices of protest began to emerge. Unhappy farmers in western Iowa organized a farmer strike to withhold goods from the market, and a bonus army of 20,000 veterans of World War I marched on Washington, promising to stay until Congress approved legislation that would pay them their $1,000 bonus immediately. Farmer strikes are really interesting. I've seen them before. I've heard about them as recently as the 80s and 90s. Wisconsin farmers dumped milk in the streets in an act of protest because essentially they were saying, there's too much supply. This milk is worth nothing. The government should step in and ensure that that agricultural policy supports decent prices for what we create. So this bonus army, their presence in Washington embarrassed Hoover, who ordered police to clear the marchers out of the abandoned buildings they had been staying in. So they marched on D.C., and they were owed $1,000, which was supposed to be paid in like 1944. Many years later, it was supposed to be like almost like a Social Security kind of thing. They went to Washington to get it. 20,000 veterans did, because they were broke, because they said, why don't you give it to us now? General Douglas MacArthur carried out the mission to clear these veterans out of the city, and he greatly exceeded the president's orders. He literally led tanks and a machine gun detachment down Pennsylvania Avenue. It's that same street every president comes down when they're elected, in pursuit of the bonus army, who fled in terror. Their tent city was burned to the ground, and Hoover, who personified the optimistic days of the 1920s, became a symbol of the nation's failure to deal effectively with its reversal of fortunes. Hoover was nominated by Republicans again in 1932, but few people believed he could win. Democrats gathered in Chicago to nominate the governor of New York, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He's a distant cousin of Teddy Roosevelt, and he had initiated enough programs of government assistance to be able to present himself as a far more energetic and imaginative leader than Hoover. He avoided divisive cultural issues and emphasized economic grievances that people shared. He flew to Chicago to accept his nomination and promised the American people a New Deal. He won with 57.4% of the popular vote, which is incredibly high, and Democrats took both houses of Congress along with it. In the interregnum, which is a weird word, it's the period between the election and the inauguration of the new president. So every time we have an election, that old president is in office still for a few months. It used to be even longer. So during that period, the American banking system began to collapse in 1932 into 33. Depositors withdrew their money in panic, and one bank after another declared bankruptcy. It's like that scene from It's a Wonderful Life, which is a great movie. Hoover publicly sought Roosevelt's assurance that he would continue his hands-off approach to the economy, and Roosevelt publicly refused. So while this transition of power is about to occur, both the past president and future president can't agree. On the morning of March 4th, 1933, Hoover rode bitterly down Pennsylvania Avenue with a beaming Franklin Roosevelt beside him. So the nation is very sour on Hoover and very optimistic about Franklin Roosevelt at this point.